my dissertation was on industrial change and promotion of industrial change, looking in particular at public enterprise in the railway industries in the US and Canada, which was not my original dissertation topic. My original dissertation topic, when I started in 1977, was on the breakdown of authoritarianism in Spain and Portugal. I started off as a developmentalist, and I realized, about 8 months in, that there were a lot of more senior scholars who were writing on this topic. They were ahead of me by a couple of years. They were much more senior, and I was likely to be the 8th or 9th book on this topic, and that was not a great place to be for somebody who is on the job market. So I started thinking, is this really what I want to do? Even though intellectually I was very interested in it and had invested a fair amount of time learning the Spanish case in particular. I happened to run into a fellow graduate student who just finished their dissertation and said, you should write your dissertation on comparative public policy because there are jobs in that field. I said, no, I'm not sure I could be interested in that. And he said, well, write on something that you substantively have an interest in. So I said, I've always been interested in industrial change and the railway industry in particular. And he said, well, write on that. And I went home and I thought about it. And over the next month or so, I said, yeah, that sounds like something I would want to do. I didn't know the Canadian case well at that time. And so, when you develop a new expertise, either substantively or country-wise, it's an enormous investment of time. I spent a year and a half probably just learning about Canada to be able to write and teach comfortably on that topic, and I did. So I finished the dissertation in 1982. I'd already started teaching at Ohio State by that point, and said, I've said everything that I have to say about industrial policy, and so I'm going to switch and write about something else, because I developed an interest in budgets and social policy, and so I actually switched substantive fields, which was a very risky thing to do at that point. I was very lucky because when I taught for 2 years at Ohio State, moved to the Brookings Institution, which at that point was the greatest place in the world to work because they gave you lots of freedom to write on things that were interesting to you as long as they were somewhat policy related. And so I was able to make that transition because the program director had a lot of faith in me. So again, it was a risky thing to do, but I'm glad that now, 35 years later, I've found a field that continues to interest me rather than staying in one, which because of the sunk cost of having learned that field, I probably couldn't have remained interested in for the last 35 years. It has to be something that you have a passion about. I mean, that's not just true when you're starting off your career, but it has to be something that continues throughout your career. That if you're not intellectually interested in something, if there aren't puzzles that continue to say, I want to find out the answer to that question, then you're not going to be a good researcher and you're not going to be a good teacher. So again, there are risks to switching once you've made the investment, but it's certainly worth thinking about doing. And even starting off, I just happen to have an interest in the railroad industry, always had, and it sustained me through 5 years of writing my dissertation. And at the end of that 5 years, I wasn't so interested in the railroad industry anymore. I'd been there, I'd done that, I went on to something else. But a lot of people who start off and writing on something that they're not very interested in, don't make it through the whatever X number of years it takes to write your dissertation. And it did take me through those years. So the U.S., because I was working at the Brookings Institution, and that's their major area of interest. And Canada, I had a sunk cost in having learned about the country. Sweden, I got involved very shortly after I got to Brookings on a comparative project on Swedish economic policy that Brookings was doing in cooperation with the Swedish think tank. And so I studied Swedish and again, developed a sunk cost. And having done that, and incidentally, I talk in terms of sunk cost, but it's also, developing a real passion and an interest. And I have, continued to have that interest in both Canada and Sweden. So it partly was, happenstance. I chose Canada because they have an industry that was similar enough in structure to the U.S. that it made sense as a comparative case study. I'd always had some interest in it, never studied it, seriously until I started doing my dissertation research. So a lot of it is happy happenstance, that I went down a path. So there's some element of path dependence, but I also decided that I liked that path, and so continued to go down that path. I could have turned around and gone on another path, but you hopefully stay on paths that you like. So again, that's an interesting story, and I think the main piece of advice that I would give to any scholar at any stage in their career is, the diligence, spending a lot of time are important. The most important skill is listening. That I happened to be at a panel at the American Political Science Association, and Rod Kiewit from Caltech asked a question in this panel that I was just sitting in on. I don't think I was participating in the panel. And he said, why do politicians ever index any programs for inflation? Because it takes away credit claiming opportunities that they can increase benefits, and that would make they can then claim credit for doing that. And so I said, this is a really interesting question. I started writing a book on the politics of indexation, and still mostly within a credit claiming emphasis, but started writing about blame avoidance. And my, at that time, Brookings colleague Steve Smith, who's now at Washington University in St. Louis, said, I like what you're writing, but the really interesting stuff is about blame avoiding, which had, it had sort of been there sotto voce, but wasn't a real focus. And, again, I listened to what he said and said, yeah, this really is the most interesting thing. And that led to realization that a focus on blame avoidance could help explain the phenomenon that I was looking at, that I wasn't very satisfied with the explanations before, and that it was highly generalizable to a whole variety of phenomenon. That led me to Kahneman and Tversky's work. This is 1984, 85, which then wasn't cited at all within political science. So, bringing those things together, but, my main point here is if I hadn't listened to those two people, to Rod saying, here's an interesting puzzle, and to Steve saying, you're on to something here in terms of explaining that puzzle, then I'm not sure that that would have ever happened. And, I think throughout my career, these sorts of things where, you just listen to people who are maybe challenging what you're saying, not in an antagonistic way. You should also listen when people are challenging you in an antagonistic way, but listening to things about what are interesting puzzles, about what in your findings that maybe you didn't think was the main thing, in fact, is what other people are likely to find most interesting. That ability to listen, I think, is, just absolutely critical for doing interesting work and doing work that other people are going to find interesting. Generally, the question of behavior change and what governments can do to try to produce behavior change, and what are the barriers to doing that. So, so let me go back a little bit. I mean, it actually, that came from something else, which is another piece of advice I would give to young scholars, that don't view your teaching as something that is, kind of a dead weight loss in your career that you have to do in order to be able to do your research and get promoted and all that sort of stuff. View it as an opportunity. I was teaching a course in comparative public management at both at Georgetown and at Sciences Po in Paris, and a big focus for the course was policy implementation. And so I started thinking through, and also my work on welfare reform in the United States, because I did a book on the politics of welfare reform, and plan to do a second book on implementation of welfare reform. And so thinking through the process from states making policy decisions to how frontline workers interact with clients, to the barriers to behavior change, getting people to move from welfare to work, and realizing that the kind of behavioral economics Kahneman and Tversky approach, which focuses on informational barriers and cognitive barriers, mindsets, things like that, that was not the main reason why people were having difficulty moving from welfare to work. That, it came from a lack of skills, a lack of education, often health problems, domestic abuse problems, all sorts of other things. And so how could I think more comprehensively about the barriers to behavior change, and looking at a wide variety of sectors? I started looking at guinea worm in Africa and the difficulties in getting people to change their behavior. It's actually a fairly easy disease to prevent, but it requires people to change their behavior. So looking at a whole wide variety of behaviors, and that grew out of my teaching. This course on public management and implementation. And so the previous work that I had done on blame avoidance, cognitive barriers, those sorts of things, fed into this, but was also a recognition that that sort of intellectual framework of behavioral economics, which I find really useful for explaining a lot of things, is inadequate to explain the kind of phenomenon that I was looking at. So, another sort of piece of general advice here is to always start with the data, okay? And the data can be patterns of success and failure in moving from welfare to work. It can be, what works in disease prevention in Africa, and trying to figure out what's going on in the data. So it's a question of listening to your data, basically, which can be quantitative data, and it can be qualitative data as well from case studies. To listen to the data, try to figure out what the data is telling you, rather than imposing a preconceived intellectual framework to to shove the square thing into the round hole, square peg into the round hole. These different theoretical elements confronted the different empirical realities I was looking at, and that led me to think well, okay, let's look at a whole variety of behavioral change things, having to do with welfare reform, having to do with HIV transmission, having to do with guinea worm, having to do with tax evasion, and say, what are some of the common elements that are at play here, both in terms of barriers to behavior change and in terms of the strategies that governments can and do use to try to address those behavior change issues. So, which led me to a variety of literatures. Starting with behavioral economics, starting with the literature on public administration from the stuff I was doing with welfare reform, but in terms of things like resistance to vaccination campaigns, literature and anthropology that I was not very familiar with. Certainly the literatures in social psychology and cognitive psychology came in there together, but all in the interest of, well, how can I, as parsimoniously as possible, explain as wide a range of behaviors as possible, and thinking about what the underlying dynamics were, which are not simple. So there's not one barrier, there are multiple barriers, but you can pull out from those some underlying patterns that allow you to make sense. Yeah, but to make sense of what the underlying structure of barriers are and how that differs in different situations, and then ultimately what we're trying to do is understand how the world works. I mean, that's always what I've been trying to do, and to do it in a way that balances parsimony. That you don't want to just say, well, there's this and there's this and there's this, and have a whole laundry list of things, but to try to find underlying patterns, underlying motivations of behavior, underlying structures of institutions that may affect the way that people behave, and bring that to bear on a variety of phenomena. So I would say that certainly my time at Brookings, and I spent 19 years at Brookings before I went to the McCourt School, and I still have a base at Brookings, but my primary base is at the McCourt School. We had a joke among the staff there that it was at that point more so than today, it was a book writing culture, and you wrote a book, and then you wrote another book, and then you wrote another book, and that you had to have that last chapter that had policy recommendations in it. And so I think more than sort of your modal political scientist, I've always, since my time at Brookings, thought about, what are the policy implications of this? Because that was part of your job. I mean, at Brookings, you did interesting social science research, at least we hoped it was interesting. But, ultimately it should have some, it should have some policy implications at the end. So, I think that certainly oriented me in a way differently than most political scientists for whom the highest objective has always been to publish in the American Political Science Review or the American Journal of Political Science, which I've never done, and have never really aspired to do. I have always felt that the research ultimately should tell us something about what we should do or what we shouldn't do about the real world. I'd say I have a greater passion for the understanding what's really going on than for the the ultimate policy recommendations, because I'm not very confident that I can come up with things that are likely to solve the problem, maybe mitigate the problem, but not solve the problem. But I was never able to just say, well, it doesn't matter what the policy implications are. And that came from being at Brookings. But it certainly, in terms of what I do, it had a big change, or it made a big change moving from Brookings to Georgetown. That at Brookings, certainly early in my career there, the major products were single author books and edited books. And I did a lot of single author books, and I did a lot of edited books. And then since I moved to McCourt, I've done almost entirely writing for journals. And there are a variety of reasons for that. In a university department, they think that journals are what carries prestige. That was fine with me. As I have gotten a little older, my attention span has maybe gotten a little shorter, and I tended to write long books, and so writing a number of journal articles in a year was, particularly because as my research interests, instead of narrowing, have broadened. I can write an article on behavior change, and I can write an article on self-undermining policy feedbacks. Now I'm doing a lot of stuff on the motivations of politicians, and in particular, focusing how they reconcile when they have both electoral objectives and career objectives in terms of advancement on career ladders, and substantive policy objectives, and other sorts of objectives, how they reconcile those that I can sort of play off all of those interests and keep from getting bored. I mean, I think the worst thing that can happen to an academic is they get bored and they just keep doing variations on the same old thing because it's safer and they've made the investments. And I understand the incentives are strong to do that early in your career, because until you get tenure or some other form of job security, sunk cost, comparative advantage, and learning a new country, a new substantive area, a new set of theories, all take time. But I really encourage people to, every 10 years or so, not entirely reinvent themselves, but think about some serious variations on what they're doing. So, I've been writing much more on policy implementation and on aspects of that, including frontline workers, including behavior change, because it's a new area of interest to me. Yeah, that's something that got started around 1988 when I was asked by U.S. Information Agency to go to Europe and do a lecture tour mostly on social policy, and that was going to be in Germany, but they said, we want to send you to another country as well, and there's an interest in Spain on think tanks because it was a newly democratized country. And so I said, okay, I can talk about think tanks, and I started looking at the literature and prepared a paper which ended up being in PS, Political Science and Politics, on think tanks, and there just wasn't a big literature on it at that point, and so I actually gathered some data and developed a categorization of think tanks, and continued to work in that area for about 15 years. Never as my main line of research, but something that I was interested in, and other people started doing more work in that area. Diane Stone, for example, and Andrew Rich in the United States, and I was able to work with Andy a little bit, and I've worked some with Diane as well. About a little over a decade ago, I sort of decided I just have to pare back. I'm doing too many different things. I can't keep up with all this literature. People like Diane and Andy are doing wonderful work in this area, and I can't keep up with the literature and write about it in a way that I think is going to be as interesting as what they have to say. So that's sort of like I shed my industrial policy past after my dissertation, and I have sort of shed the doing think tank stuff. I'm still interested in idea transfer and cross-national learning, particularly in the substantive area that I write about now the most, which is public pension policy. But I just decided I'm not going to continue to write in the think tank area because I just can't keep up with all these literature. So again, at some point in your career, you may have to say, okay, well, I invested a lot of time in that, but I don't have the passion for it that I do for these other topics, and so I'm just not going to write about that anymore. So. The three main sort of theoretical areas that I'm interested in now are behavior change and self-undermining policy feedback. So I've written on that with both Alan Jacobs at University of British Columbia and John Oberlander at University of North Carolina, because I think the literature, based on Paul Pearson's, terrific work, Paul's a good friend of mine, but the emphasis had increasingly become on self-reinforcing policy feedbacks and how once you go down a path, it's difficult to change. I think that was overemphasized, that policies can also have self-undermining aspects, things like they become expensive, they start creating new clienteles of people who were losers from those policies, who may be able to at some point overcome collective action barriers and get organized, or there may be losers who were there before a new policy was enacted, lose from the new policy and don't go away, that they don't sort of give in and adjust. People like Eric Potashnik have written about this. The self-undermining policy feedbacks is an area that increasingly I'm writing on, and I've already written some stuff in relation to pension policy in particular, because you can see the enormous self-undermining policy feedbacks there, as long as along with the self-reinforcing ones. So you have these two things in conflict with one another. And then the other area that I've been working on a lot in the last few years, and that it's just starting to come out, is stuff on the motivations of politicians looking beyond the sort of blame avoiding and credit claiming to other sorts of electoral motivations. So I've been writing a lot about blame generating recently, and not just in the electoral context, but how generating blame against policy proposals affects every stage of the policymaking process, from the agenda setting process, for example, that just to take sort of a classic example of healthcare in the United States, that conservative opponents of more universal health care coverage have said, to quote Donald Trump, well, that may work in Canada, but it's not good in the United States, and this is not a new line. This is something that's been around ever since the United States started considering more universal health care. But if you define something as being foreign or socialist or something like that, back to Bachrach and Baratza's work in the 1950s or early 1960s on the second phase of power, that's a way to limit the agenda and keep ideas that you don't want off the policy agenda. Clearly you see it in terms of policy adoption as well, again taking healthcare as an example, that saying once the issue gets on the agenda that this will cause some people to, if you have more universal coverage, to have worse coverage, again to try to keep something from being adopted. And policy implementation, clearly you can see in the case of U.S. healthcare that generating blame about people being required to purchase insurance even when they don't want to do it, and other supposed negative effects of Obamacare and Medicaid expansion have played a big part in politics. So thinking through how these electoral objectives and also policy objectives are intertwined with resistance to healthcare. You can see the same thing in pension reform policies, and how that interacts with other sets of motivations and how that interacts with institutions. So, to take the example of what I've been working on recently, why was Sweden able to reform its healthcare system when its pension system, when the United States has not been able to for the last 30 years? Part of it has to do with both formal and informal institutional arrangements in Sweden that muted the blame-generating opportunities that, because politicians recognized some common policy interests, and they were able to create what I call a policy-making cartel, where they agreed not to generate blame against each other so that they could achieve these common policy interests. Politicians in the United States have never been able to do that, both because they were polarized on policy, but also because in a situation of electoral competition, they were never able to find institutional structures, except in 1983, but not since then, that allowed them to resist the temptation to generate blame. When you're in close electoral competition, if credit claiming opportunities are muted, then blame generating is your other way to try to differentiate yourself from parties. So thinking about how essentially structure and agency are connected to one another, how the motivations, politicians always have a complex set of motivations, so which ones actually get triggered and which ones get acted on is embedded within the sort of broader institutional structure. So structure, agency, politicians, motivations questions are the other sort of newish area. It goes back to stuff that I did 30 plus years ago, but I'm finding sort of new phenomenon to explore, and sort of new concepts to, at least new to me, to try to explain this. But again, I would say it goes back to listening to the data. And data can be quantitative data. Data can be phenomena that are occurring in real time, and both in the healthcare sector in the United States and in pension policy cross-nationally. I saw patterns of what kinds of reforms occurred, when they occurred, how they occurred, that I didn't think were adequately explained by existing theories, and that led me to look for what existing theories I could bring to bear and combine to explain these things and keep me interested, and hopefully a few other people find it interesting too. Oh, I don't, I don't place a lot of importance on being remembered for something. But I guess I would say right now, certainly the work that's most cited is the work on blame avoidance. But what I would say is, I'm hoping that the things that I'm working on right now will be the things that I'm most remembered for, because they're the things that are most exciting to me. Yeah. So my wife's mother's cousin is a professor. He's an anthropologist at the University of Washington, and he just finished his most recent book at the age of 94 and said, I'm not sure I have another book in me. And so I'm hoping that at 94 or 97 would be better. I'll be saying, I'm not sure I have another book in me, but hopefully I have some more research in me between now and 94. It's a long time away.
It's a long time away.
So I think what has changed for the better is that, particularly through ICPP, but other forums. So the joint workshops through the European Consortium on Political Research, they're now more established venues where scholars of public policy can get together, network, and find areas where they can collaborate on research. That's become more institutionalized, and I think that that's a really good thing, because it brings people together who otherwise wouldn't necessarily find each other's work and collaborate. So I organized some panels at this workshop with Anat Gofen, who's an Israeli scholar at Hebrew University, whose work I ran across in journals, and I just sent her an email and said, I really find your work interesting. It's kind of similar to mine, and so I still haven't met her. I'll meet her today, but we organized these panels together, and we've talked about doing collaborative research, and put together 3 interesting panels on issues of target compliance and non-compliance. And so we're now meeting other people who we probably wouldn't have met if it hadn't been for ICPP, because we put together the panel proposal, and then we have scholars who from all over the world, from Norway, from the US, from Laos, from China, from Singapore, from Switzerland, who have a common theoretical interest examining different phenomenon. But again, that's part of the listening process, that it turns out that I can learn a lot from scholars at the Indian Institute of Management, Ahmedabad, who are writing about the government of India's mostly failed efforts to get monetization of gold, because people in India invest a lot in gold, and how can they turn that into more productive investment, and people aren't complying with it. Well, that's an area that I'd not thought about, but it turns out that there's a very complex chain of actors involved in this process. The people at the end of the process are the individuals who are making decisions on whether to invest in gold or not invest in gold, and how to do that. But there are banks, there are jewelers, and others in this process of that ends up with a lot of non-compliance with government policy. But thinking through that complex supply chain of non-compliance is something that has enriched my understanding of the kinds of theoretical issues that I'm interested in. And you know, that's more data, right? That I have to listen to say, well, how does this fit into the kind of intellectual framework I've been using, the kinds of theories I've been using, and how do I need to revise it in light of this new data that's very different from the kind of data that I've been looking at before. And you know, that's exciting. And it wouldn't have happened if it hadn't been for ICPP and bringing together, you know, a wide variety of scholars from different countries with common theoretical interests, but you know, very different empirical phenomena that we're dealing with. You know, listening is the main thing. Listening to your data, listening to other people. That's I'd say the most important piece of advice I would have is to do that. You know, a second one that I touched on a little bit was leveraging your teaching. That don't view it as a, you know, something that you have to do. View it as something that can lead to that creates intellectual puzzles that you have to explain to students, and that you can use that also to fuel your research agenda. So that would be a second broad thing. You know, a third piece of advice I would give is don't be a perfectionist in terms of when you get feedback, you reach out for feedback on things. In particular, sending things to journals. You know, there are some things I should have sent to journals and gotten feedback on, and they would have said, you know, you're 85% of the way. You know, do these revisions, and you know, you can publish this. But I never did because I sort of set my standards too high before I would send it out. So, you know, don't send out stuff that's bad, but send out stuff that you're not entirely satisfied with, and get the feedback. And you know, you may get a rejection from that journal, but you know, there's another journal that maybe send it first to your journal that is your second preferred journal. They reject it, you improve it, send it to your first journal, and then they don't like it either. Well, then you sort of move down the, you know, down the tiers of journals. So another piece of advice would be that, you know, nobody's ever gonna, you're never gonna write anything that everybody likes, that academics, for a variety of reasons, both different sort of intellectual frameworks, you know, personal jealousies and rivalries, about a third of your readership is not gonna like what you do, and you know, and of that third, half of them will tell you to your face, and another half of those people tell you to your face, and the other half will behind your back. They don't like it. So you're never going to please all of the people all of the time. You have to have self-confidence. If you think it's interesting, then don't get too discouraged. Again, listen to the feedback, but ultimately you have to decide that it's something that's worth pursuing. And that's really hard, especially when you're young in your career, and any criticism can be just crushing. So, you know, it's hard to say don't be crushed, but you know, don't be crushed. And so, and what I would say to, you know, more senior scholars is, you know, try to avoid crushing people. Don't, you know, be kind to younger scholars because they are feeling pretty insecure about what they're doing a lot of the time. So be self-confident if you're younger, be kind if you're older, you know, keep your intellectual passion up, and if that means that you have to examine new phenomena and, you know, look at new countries, you know, do something else, you know, nobody benefits if you've lost your intellectual passion. So keep that intellectual passion up. So that'd be the advice I would give.